Now that you've learned the fundamentals, it's time to learn about the most magical, easiest to use step in Parabola, the custom transform step. In short, with this step, you can automate any data transformation simply by describing in plain language what you'd like to automate. And to show you just how powerful this step can be, in this example, we'll use a custom transform to replicate the logic that it took us 4 steps to build at the beginning of this flow. I'll get started with a simple example with a custom transform step where we'll just go ahead and calculate revenue. Now, as I open up this step, all you need to do is just describe in plain language what you'd like to automate. In this example, calculate revenue as currency. And what Parabola is doing here is analyzing the structure of our data running through the flow and your instructions to ultimately use AI to generate custom code that we use to transform our dataset. As this loads, you can see we have a new revenue column added to the right-hand side of our dataset, along with a logic summary that provides an overview of the AI-generated code that Parabola created to actually transform our dataset. Now, as you might already know from working with large language models, the more detailed and specific our instructions, the higher quality and more consistent our results are going to be. Parabola makes it really easy to improve your prompts with this Optimize Prompt button, which will just ask Parabola's chat a question about how do I optimize this prompt. Parabola is trained on best practices for writing prompts to make this really easy, and will actually return an updated prompt directly into this step, which has all of those best practices baked in. The only other setting to be aware of here is at the bottom of our settings where we can select between whether we want to reuse our logic or regenerate on every step calculation. The big difference here, when you hit reuse this logic, which is the most common option, that's just going to run the exact same code every single time, so it's super, super consistent. You might use regenerate logic in situations where the data coming into the step is dynamic. Maybe it's coming from a third party where you might have different column headers and you want Parabola to actually interpret what are the correct columns to use here. This also is really common for situations where we're working with dynamic date values, where maybe if you always want to find the last 7 days, that could be a good opportunity for regenerate logic, so you're always dynamically finding the last 7 days and not using static date values. Now we'll move on to something a bit more complex, where we're using a custom transform to replicate the logic across edit columns, filter rows, format dates, and add math column. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a custom transform at the beginning of my flow here, and I'm going to paste in a prompt that captures all of that logic. As you can see here, we are keeping specific columns, we're renaming, we are filtering, reformatting dates, and creating that new revenue column. And we hear a lot of questions about what's the best way to get started writing these prompts. And my biggest piece of advice is to just write these as if you're explaining to a teammate over Slack what they should do to an Excel sheet. You can always get some initial thoughts down, hit optimize prompt, and get something better. And along the way, you can think about how can I make this as precise as possible by doing things like referencing column names in quotes, specifying the output format that you're looking for, and even providing example values so that you get something nice and clean back like this. Now, I'll leave you with one last piece of advice here around when to actually use this step. Should you build a flow that just has a million custom transform steps changed together? My advice is generally, if there is a purpose-built step for what you're trying to accomplish, use one of those steps. Use an edit columns, use a filter row. You don't have to worry about writing a prompt, handling edge cases, providing example values, and those will be quicker and more straightforward to set up. But if you do have a transformation that you know is going to take a bunch of steps chained together, or you're trying to do a transformation that Parabola doesn't have a step for today, those are all great use cases for a custom transform. And if you're ever in doubt about what's the best step to use, you can just use the sidebar and actually ask Parabola. If you do have other questions or are curious to learn more about prompting best practices, feel free to check out the resources below, and good luck playing around.